Today we'll be going over the Findings tab, and while normally on this tab you'll see the findings for all of your assets from any license type, specifically we'll be concentrating on SAST today. So what you'll be seeing is the vulnerability ID, the rating, the class, the status, last opened, last closed, the asset name, asset type, last retest, and retest. So the vulnerability ID is how we uniquely identify that particular vulnerability. So if you ever have questions and you don't use the Ask a Question feature, which I'll be going over soon, you're going to want to provide this vulnerability ID so we know which one you're talking about. The rating, critical, high, medium, low, or note. Class, what type of vulnerability is it? Status by default is going to show open, and that way if you fix something it disappears from your view. However, if you want to filter on other statuses, you would go to vulnerability status, and you can also filter on closed, accepted, invalid, and mitigated, and out of scope. The last open date will appear here. The last closed date, if you're filtering on closed, will appear. The asset name, since again it could be for any of your assets, asset type, since it could be for any of your license types, but in this case it's going to say application, as that is the same thing as SAST for us. Last retest date is not going to be filled out, as for SAST, it retests every single time you scan. So if you want to trigger a scan, you're going to want to press the Scan Now button on the Scan tab for that particular asset. And that's why here you only see this little clock icon, as again, it just retests whenever it scans. Back over here to quick actions. Chain link icon will give you a quick view of the vector information, the vector ID, the file name, and the input source line. If you want to add any notes, if you click on the speech bubble icon, you can add a note. And this will be internal for your team. They're not going to be notes that we, WhiteHat, will be looking at or reading. And then if adding vulnerability tags would help you, then you can go ahead and click on the gift tag icon and put in a tag right there. So you'll notice that we have these green V's and these grayed out V's. So the difference would be the green V's are for SAST SE licenses, which means they're verified by our vulnerability verification team, whereas for our SAST EE license, which is this one here, that grayed out V means we haven't verified it because that vulnerability verification does not come with SAST EE licensing. You'll also notice a couple other symbols I haven't yet talked about. So one is this icon here, and what that indicates is that's not WhiteHat's default vulnerability rating. It's been changed, in this case low from whatever it was before. So that's just a quick way for you to visually see what isn't a WhiteHat default rating. You'll also notice that there's this wrench icon, and that means that directed remediation is available for that particular vulnerability. What directed remediation is you can apply the patch that we have. Once you click on the vulnerability ID, apply it to your code, and it fixes it. This is only available to limited vulnerabilities, but for those it is available for, it's very, very useful. So to just show you a few things for bulk actions, so just to give you a couple of examples. So retest vulnerability is not going to apply for SAST, so you're not going to use that for SAST assets, as again, in order to trigger vulnerability, you need the scan to actually run. Customize vulnerability. I will be showing you in a different video how to customize vulnerabilities. Now, change vulnerability status, this only applies for SAST EE. Now, I highlighted one from EE and one from SE, so you can see how one will appear and one won't. So you'll see that the SE one is grayed out, you won't be able to modify it, and again that's because it's SAST SE, whereas SAST EE, you're able, since this vulnerability applies to an EE site, you're able to invalidate it or open. So since for EE, the WhiteHat team does not verify the vulnerabilities, you will need to go through yourselves and basically go through each of the findings we have put into Sentinel for you, and you'll have to either verify it or not. So you can validate it if it's not an actual finding so that you can track it that way, or if you need to open it, you can do that as well. And then just hit confirm. So then if I hop into one of these vulnerabilities by clicking on the vulnerability ID, it takes me to the vulnerability detail page. So what you'll see on this page is the vulnerability class, the vulnerability ID, where it's located, the open date, how long it's been open, the verification statuses, if it's past compliance, if you have that set up, the CVSS score information, And then over on the right, the rating, and then if you click the arrow, you can see how the impact and likelihood plays into the overall white hat rating. Down here at the bottom, you can trace the vulnerability. So there's this part up here where you can go through each part of the trace of the vulnerability flow and track it all the way from the source, which is where the vulnerability is located, down to the sink, which is where it's actually exploited. Now, some vulnerabilities have a much simpler data flow. This one is a little bit more complicated. So you can see that visually by going to vulnerability elements, and you can see all the arrows and how they play in to going from the source to the sink. Description and solution. So make sure to hit read more to be able to see everything. So you're able to view basically what is the vulnerability. So in this case, it's cross-site scripting. So you can look up the definition, look at outside resources, and just generally get a feel for what is that vulnerability, as well as the solution. So we provide solution guidance, as well as outside references to help you. Here we have Ask a Question. So this is your direct line to our Threat Research Center Vulnerability Verification team. And this is where you can directly ask them questions. And you can expect any questions that you've asked to be answered within about 24 business hours. So it already has the vulnerability ID, so you don't need to provide that. So this would be questions like, maybe I don't understand the description, or I don't understand, why is this a real vulnerability? Why do I need to fix it? Anything like that, feel free to ask. I mentioned directed remediation before, and this is the patch. So essentially you can see the patch here, then you can download it and apply it to your code, and then it's fixed. And then if there's any vulnerability notes, you can add these here. Again, they're not going to be notes for us White Hat, they're going to be notes for you and your team. If you have any other findings related questions for SAST and this did not answer your question, please feel free to reach out to our technical support team.